Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1041 for January 28th, 2024. Coming up in a few minutes.
There are stories here that we're missing that bourbon books are not writing about because Tennessee whiskey can have similarities in terms of process as bourbon, but it's a different title, it's a different state, it's a different mentality.
Much of Tennessee whiskey's history has been considered lost until now. Historian and podcaster Drew Hannush has gone through archives and old books to piece together what may be the most complete record of Tennessee whiskey history. His new book, The Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey, has just been published, and it sheds a new light on some of what we thought we knew about people like the Reverend Dan Cole, Jack Daniel, and Nearest Green. I'll talk with Drew Hannush later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Greetings, everyone. It's Gabriel Cardarello with Jewers, and I have big news. Jewers is about to unveil the first chapter of a 4-part collector series dedicated to honoring the most famous whiskey-producing regions of Scotland. More on that in a bit.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
The average college basketball power forward is 6'9", which, according to my rough calculations, is 16.5 times my height. I'll stick to aimlessly pottering around in back gardens.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast, Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Heaven Hill is closing its bottling operations at its Lethbridge, Alberta distillery, where Black Velvet Canadian whiskey is produced. Bottling will be moved to Heaven Hill's main campus in Bardstown, Kentucky, after company executives decided needed upgrades to the bottling operation in Lethbridge weren't economically feasible. The company is providing outplacement help for employees who will be affected by the shutdown next month. No word on how many employees will lose their jobs, but Heaven Hill says it's committed to keeping Black Velvet distilling in Lethbridge. Irish Distillers is getting out of the beer business. It's selling 8 Degrees Brewing back to co-founders Scott Bajent and Cameron Wallace. The pair founded 8 Degrees back in 2010, and Irish Distillers bought the Cork-based brewery in 2018 to ensure a supply of beer for its Jameson Caskmates whiskeys. The brewery will continue to supply beer for seasoning Caskmates barrels, and Irish Distillers has agreed to continue distributing 8 Degrees beer in Ireland. In other news, last year's excise tax hike in Great Britain may have cost the UK government nearly $100 million in lost tax revenue from decreased alcohol sales. The Scotch Whisky Association analyzed HMRC tax receipts and found a year-on-year drop of 5% between the time the tax hike took effect in August and the end of December. The tax hike is being blamed for an unexpected rise in the UK's inflation rate last year. SWA executives are urging the government to cut duties in the March budget address to Parliament. The Macallan has released its first whiskey commemorating the distillery's 200th anniversary this year. Tales of the Macallan Volume 2 celebrates Macallan founder Alexander Reed and was distilled in 1949. As you might expect, the 73-year-old whiskey comes in a bespoke Lalique decanter, and as you also might expect, it's expensive. Just 344 decanters will be available worldwide, with a suggested retail price of $89,000 each. Glenmorangie has released the 5th edition in its Barrel Select series, using different cask finishes to bring out different characters in its whiskey. This 5th edition uses Calvados apple and pear brandy casks. According to Glenmorangie's Dr. Bill Lumsden, the casks bring out scents of jasmine and orchards with flavors of toffee apples, lemon balsam, and spice. It's a limited edition release. There's no word on pricing. Scotland's Wolfburn Distillery has released a new single malt to mark its 11th anniversary. The whiskey comes from a single cask laid down in 2015 and is bottled at 54.8% ABV. It's available exclusively through the Wolfburn website for £89.99 a bottle. Heaven Hill is out with this year's first edition of Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Bourbon. Batch A124 is 10 years and 9 months old and bottled at 59.5% ABV. It'll carry a recommended retail price of $74.99 a bottle in the U.S. I received a sample this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Diageo-backed Lodestar Whiskey has released its first whiskey. It's a blend of high rye bourbon and American single malt. Diageo's Distill Ventures unit invested in the woman-owned brand last year. Lodestar carries a recommended retail price of $45 a bottle. And finally, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And when you're a winemaker with vineyards full of smoke-tainted grapes, make a smoky whiskey out of them. Oregon's Patricia Green Cellars has released 2 whiskeys made with a blend of brandy Pinot Noir distillate with 80% conventional whiskeys distilled from grain. Multifarious uses 3 different strains of barley, while Purple Karma Pinnacle uses Pinnacle Heritage barley. The winery and distillery sourced all of its grains from local farmers, and the whiskeys are available at the Newberg, Oregon-based winery. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's check the calendar and see what's happening in the world of whiskey. First off, tickets for this year's Spirit of Speyside Festival events go on sale Wednesday at noon GMT. Tickets are still available for the Castle and Key Bourbon Dinner at Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky, Wednesday night. The Whiskey Global is this coming Saturday in Kelowna, British Columbia, along with the Kalamazoo Bourbon Fest in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts, hosts a Tullibardine single malt tasting this Wednesday night and a Westland whiskey tasting on the 14th. Catoctin Creek Distilling in Purcellville, Virginia hosts its annual Valentine's Day dinner Friday the 16th, and the Galaxy Whiskey Gala is on the 17th in Austin, Texas. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. There's a lot that we still don't know about whiskey's history, and the stories we do know about often need to be updated as new facts are discovered. Historian and podcaster Drew Hannush spent a year researching the history of Tennessee whiskey for his new book, The Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey, Heroes, Villains, and Legends from a Whiskey Story Time Forgot. Drew is best known for his Whiskey Lore podcast, and this is his 3rd book. We talked this week on a Zoom call. What prompted you to write this book in the first place? What do we not know about Tennessee whiskey that your book solved?
Well, I was surprised when I first started traveling across Tennessee. I was doing distillery visits in Kentucky initially, and every distillery I went to, I got these great stories about the history of bourbon. And then I went to Scotland, and I was getting great stories about the history of Scotch and then stories about the distilleries themselves. But when I went across Tennessee, it was like everybody was telling the Jack Daniel's story and the George Dickel story, which makes sense in hindsight because we're talking about they basically controlled the whiskey in Tennessee for a century or so. So everything that happened before that was kind of lost to time. So I kept thinking as I was going from distillery to distillery that there's some stories here that it seems like they're missing. And I had stopped at the Lost State Distillery in Bristol, and they mentioned that Evan Shelby, a Revolutionary War hero, had been the first distiller in Tennessee and that he distilled back in the 1700s. And I'm thinking, well, that's a story. And why is nobody really digging into that story? And then soon after, I heard the story of Nelson's Greenbrier and that Charles Nelson had the biggest distillery in Tennessee, bigger than Jack Daniel or George Dickel. And I'm thinking, okay, here's another guy we need to know about. And then the Uncle Nearest story came along, and it's like, okay, there are stories here that we're missing that bourbon books are not writing about, because Tennessee whiskey can have similarities in terms of process as bourbon, but it's a different title. It's a different state. It's a different mentality. So I just feel like it was something that needed to be investigated.
A lot of people think that Tennessee whiskey history begins with Jack Daniels and George Dickel, and it really goes back to Evan Shelby. Tell us about him.
So he's an interesting character because he came down from Maryland, and he had several issues that went on where he was living at that time, including having his house burned down. He was starting to look into North Carolina, around where Daniel Boone came from, looking for property. And then all of a sudden, this thing called the Royal Proclamation Line that was put in place by the king in 1763 that had closed off all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains to settlement opened up. And this got him interested in potentially moving into what is now Eastern Tennessee. Now, he thought he lived in Virginia at the time, and he set up a mercantile, and this is around 1773, and decided to start selling and bartering with people around the area. And one of the people he was bartering with was Daniel Boone. And I went to the Library of Congress and actually found some receipts between Daniel Boone trading rum or acquiring rum from Evan Shelby at his store in 1773, which then opened up a whole line of questioning about rum. Interesting. This is pre-Revolutionary War, when rum was still the drink of choice of Americans. And so that got me really interested in that part of the story. And that's when I soon learned that Evan may have been actually either acquiring spirits from others, or maybe he was distilling himself on his property, but that at that time they would use sugar maple trees, take the maple syrup, and they would either convert it into sugar or they would distill it as it is to make rum, which was something that, again, they could get more value for in doing their bartering. So what's really funny is that connected to the story of Phil Pritchard, who was the first craft distiller in Tennessee after Prohibition. And he started off by making Tennessee rum. And little did he know that what he was doing was actually what Tennessee did initially when it was still part of North Carolina in terms of making rum as their first spirit.
I find that fascinating because as a lot of these records have been lost to history, haven't they?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really hard to dig up that early history. In fact, part of the reason the book focuses as much on history as it does on whiskey history is because there aren't a lot of records from that time period. But I thought it was a great opportunity to introduce people to the wild and wacky way that Tennessee developed as a state, and also to introduce tavern culture and how all of a sudden wholesaling opened up and how these farmer distillers converted into an industry, and to try to get the personality of those early distillers. They were pioneers. That was their main focus, was how do we survive? And, what do we produce from what we have in terms of whiskey? Well, we're just going to use whatever we have. So you start with Evan Shelby, who was putting in orders for rye whiskey from his distiller because he came from Maryland, and that's probably what he knew. But then eventually all of these guys that were going out there with their land grants were required to plant corn to be able to claim their land. And so now all of a sudden you have all this corn growing across Tennessee with people with stills who had full right to make whiskey without the taxman getting involved, because the taxman didn't come along until 1862, and in Tennessee even a little later, because they were actually out of the Union there for a while. So it's really interesting. And I wanted people to kind of get a sense of that, and to get a sense of what did they do with that whiskey. The tavern culture was fascinating and tied into the whole temperance movement, which hit Tennessee a lot earlier than it did a lot of other states. And Tennessee always had an issue in terms of its relationship with alcohol. So it was another story that really needed to be tied into that.
Another story we need to tie into this is the story of slavery, because we know about the story of Nearest Green, or at least we think we know the story of Nearest Green, because your book brings some questions that run counter to what we've discovered, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. But tell me about the history of slavery and whiskey in Tennessee.
So it was something that I really wanted to address up front, because when you do like I did, and you spend basically a year combing through old newspapers from the 19th century in Tennessee, you are inundated with that question of the enslaved population and how they're being talked about and how they're being treated, and knowing that they are really the ones who are doing the distilling, that you had families that were doing the distilling. Maybe the person whose name was associated with the distillery owned the distillery, but that didn't necessarily mean they were doing the work. And that's where a story like the Dan Call story and Uncle Nearest, you kind of get this idea that, oh, wait a second. Okay, it makes more sense that Nearest Green was the one that was doing the distilling. We talk about Dan Call, but Dan Call was the man who had hired him to do that distilling. So Dan Call is the one during that time period that's going to end up getting the praise. So for me, when I started doing this writing, I really had to think about how I was going to approach that, because I knew any distiller that I talked about before the Civil War likely had an enslaved person that was doing the distilling for them, but there'd be no record of them. So at the very beginning, I basically state, always assume that whoever is doing the distilling there is likely not the person whose name is associated with it. And we can even go back to Evan Shelby and talk about the fact that his distiller was Pierce Wall, who was a man that he was contracting to do his distilling for him. So to call Evan Shelby the first distiller in Tennessee is hard to do, because was he the first distiller, or was he just contracting somebody else to do that distilling? Or in the case of like a Frederick Stump, who became the biggest distiller around the Nashville area pre-1800, he had a large plantation with a lot of enslaved workforce on there. So I doubt that Frederick Stump ever touched that still. He had other people that were doing that for him.
Let's talk about Dan Call. And you used the term worked with, and I want to emphasize that Call was a slave owner or a slave leaser, because he didn't hire necessarily Nearest Green. He rented him.
Well, this is
in the pre-Civil War.
Well, this is what's interesting. I covered as much as I could prove for the most part. Now, the Jack Daniel's story and the Uncle Nearest story can be difficult because there was a fire at the Jack Daniel distillery in 1930 and all of their records are gone. So that's the tough part. The other part about this is when you actually look at the records, we get the date 1866 that's always associated with Jack Daniel's. And I kind of go into why so many distilleries reference that time. It's right when the Civil War ended. So a lot of distilleries will use that 1866 date. And I think for many of them, it was the first opportunity for whoever's name is on the distillery to get into business, not necessarily as a distiller, but this is when they started in some form of business. And so they used that date as, here's my inception date. So what I was finding with Dan Call is the earliest record for him owning an official distillery was in 1875. And that was in a record that was basically written 2 years later that was giving Jack Daniel the ability to join with him. Now, I take that back. He actually owned 2 other distilleries earlier than that, but only 2 years before and 4 years before, when he was working with one of Jack Daniel's mentors. And now I'm forgetting his name, but anyway, the Tully was one of them, and the other was a colonel. I've forgotten his name, but anyway, and basically Dan Call, from what I can find in the records, just kind of fell into this job because he owned the land that the distillery was on. And then when one of the people left, he ended up becoming one of the partners in the distillery. So it's an interesting history. And what it shows me is that, well, and the other thing is that what I see in terms of the records for Nearest Green was he was 27 years old when he went to work for Dan Call. And this was well after the Civil War. So he worked for him. Nearest Green would have been an enslaved person during the Civil War, but his time actually working with Dan Call seems to have come after the Civil War.
Which sort of turns the whole enslavement story on its head.
It does. And that story comes from the Jack Daniel Legacy book. And this is what I like to say about oral tradition. Oral tradition is usually correct in some form. But if I tell somebody a story and they tell somebody else and they tell somebody else and it comes back to me, it grows over time. And it can also fall out of actual chronological order. So those stories were gathered from people who knew Dan Call, who knew Jack Daniel, who knew the Green family. But when they told those stories, here's somebody in the 1960s who's trying to piece all of that together and isn't going in and looking at those old records. And so timelines get messed up and facts become obscured. And so when you're trying to piece those together, it makes it, for me, as somebody researching, it's like, I want to make that story true. I just, with the facts that I have at hand, I can't make it exactly the same.
And I think you were thinking of Colonel Hughes.
Colonel Hughes, yes, absolutely.
I looked in the book.
Yeah, Colonel Hughes is an interesting character because in the Legacy book, they do reference Colonel Hughes as being somebody that Jack Daniel worked with at one point. And that fits into what I've set up in terms of the accurate timelines. But this would put Jack Daniel well outside of the Civil War era. And it actually matches up with some other stories in that book as well, where it said that he would take a wagon with his buddy Button Wagner, and they would go down to Alabama and they would go to Huntsville with whiskey, and then they would give it and sell it to Union soldiers. Well, after the war was Reconstruction. So there were Union soldiers in Huntsville, Alabama at that time. And it would have been less risky for him to be going down at that time period. Whereas if he was taking wagon loads through during the Civil War, he's going through a lot of Union soldiers, and the town of Fayetteville, close to where he was at, that he would have to go through, was basically shut down because the Union soldiers were encamped there. So it's interesting, like putting a puzzle together, trying to figure out how to make all of this stuff work. And to say that I'm 100% sure that the way I've come up with this is true, I can't say that. That's the thing about history. The more we find, the more evidence we find, the more these stories could shift over time. So my job was to try to make it as accurate as I could with the information that I had on hand.
So your records indicate, from what you've been able to find, that Dan Call never owned Nearest Green.
If he did, he wasn't distilling at the time. And that is because there are no records of Dan Call distilling from the time that from out of the Civil War all the way up until he gets into his partnership with Colonel Hughes. So that big time period in there, you have to say, okay, if there are no federal records, because I went to Atlanta and I was looking through the Internal Revenue records, and there was no listing of a Jack Daniel and there was no listing of a Dan Call. So he would have been making moonshine at that time if he was doing anything. And being that he was a Lutheran preacher, I'm doubting that he was probably skirting the law that way. But that's an assumption on my part. And that's why I say it could change.
So what does this bring into question, or this brings into question, really, the whole origin of the Lincoln County process, doesn't it?
It does, in a way.
Because we're told the story that Nearest Green taught Jack Daniel the Lincoln County process for running whiskey through sugar maple charcoal. But I know that your book mentions that this may have actually been patented in New Jersey.
Yes, it was.
Many years
It was.
before.
This is what's interesting. I get why Tennessee wants to claim and why over the years it's really become associated with Tennessee, because Tennessee was really one of the only states that was doing it. There was charcoal filtering going on in Ohio and Illinois with the rectifiers, who were basically taking column distill whiskey or high proof whiskey and using the charcoal to get some of the extra oils out of it so they could redistill it again and turn it into what we would consider a vodka or grain neutral spirit kind of a liquid. But in Tennessee, they were traditionalists, and to them, they didn't necessarily see the need for a barrel. And so their idea of doing charcoal mellowing was much more around smoothing the spirit out and getting those headache causing oils out without necessarily needing to put it into a barrel. They also had different distilling techniques. They fermented their grain much longer when it was going through the fermentation process, and actually got in trouble with the federal government, which caused Lincoln County to basically shut down and not distill for the most part for 4 years during, again, a time period when Mason Hughes had his operation running and previous to Jack Daniel getting his distillery up and running. So what I found was that there really was nobody calling anything a Lincoln County process at that time. It was known as Old Lincoln whiskey. And what was interesting about Old Lincoln whiskey was it did seem to have some hallmarks, which were the charcoal mellowing, but also it was using a log still. Most of them were using log stills and then doing extra long fermentations with something called, what they called the sour mash process, which we go, okay, I know what the sour mash process is by today's standards, but I had to relearn basically the difference between sweet mash and sour mash in the 19th century versus what it is today, because back then the consideration was sour mash had backset put into it. Nothing else could be done with it. It had wild yeast. Anything like that could, help it to ferment, but you could not introduce any chemical or any outside yeast. That was considered the sweet mash process to Lincoln County distillers. So that would make a very different spirit. And it's a really interesting thing to note because it differentiates Kentucky larger scale distilling from what Tennessee was doing. And it speaks to the reason why Tennessee never really grew to be a big industry, whereas Kentucky did, because Kentucky tended to mold to the laws that were coming out from the federal government. They would argue against certain ones, but for the most part, they were industrialists and they were trying to keep up with the rules and regulations. Whereas Tennessee said, no, we're not doing this. We are going to make whiskey the way we made it before the Civil War, as long as we possibly can. And in the end, it kept them small.
Let's move to modern times. Phil Pritchard, you mentioned earlier, plays a key role in the Tennessee whiskey law of 2013.
Yes.
Because he's the only distiller that's grandfathered in who doesn't have to use the Lincoln County
It's
process.
Hilarious to go look at that law because, and as I talked to Tennessee distillers and people who were around during that time period, they talk about the shoehorning that gets done sometimes with these laws. by the Tennessee Constitution, they cannot make any law that would benefit any one single individual. So in this particular case, they had to write a law that basically had an asterisk on it that said, anybody who started the distillery between 2000 or between 1999 and 2000 and is the only one to have started in Lincoln County during this time period is allowed to not use the charcoal mellowing process. So it's hilarious to read that. But as I was going through and researching Tennessee history, I found a lot of instances of this. So this is something that Tennessee legislators have learned how to use when they need to single out a person without actually defining that person and making it possible for them to isolate that person and say, okay, we're going to give you the right to do this without naming who you are.
Is it fair to say that we are in a golden age for Tennessee whiskey today?
I think we are. I would say that Tennessee now, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, the Tennessee Whiskey Trail actually sees as many people in a year as Kentucky and Scotland combined. And a lot of that has to do with Old Smoky up in the mountains, and they're in a perfect location right there to gather in a lot of people who are going to the Great Smoky Mountains. But still, this says there's a lot of opportunity for Tennessee to get their message out there and to get people interested in them. And what my last count was well over 40 distilleries in Tennessee. There's still a lot of them producing bourbons rather than Tennessee whiskeys, mostly because if you're going to source whiskey, unless you're getting it from a particular place or a couple particular places in Tennessee, there's not older stock yet to be able to say that you're producing a Tennessee whiskey. But we have not yet seen the renaissance in actual Tennessee whiskey in terms of that style versus bourbon. There's still some pushback there. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Tennessee distilleries haven't really known their history. They have been leaning on the Jack Daniel and George Dickel stories for so long that the pride in a name like Tennessee whiskey is still a little hard to sell when you have a name like bourbon that you can use that does have a long storied history to it. But I think as Tennessee distillers start to figure out that Tennessee was actually distilling before they were distilling Kentucky bourbon or even distilling in the state of Kentucky, that will add another level of pride and something that they can use in terms of telling stories during their tours and in their literature that says, hey, Tennessee whiskey does have a long storied history, and maybe we don't need to lean on the name bourbon quite so much. In fact, one of the things I found really awkward after I got through with all of this research was trying to figure out whether I should capitalize bourbon or not capitalize bourbon, because in my past books, I always did it in lowercase. But now I'm talking about styles like Old Robertson and Old Lincoln, which are named after counties. And there's no way I can lowercase Lincoln and Robertson. I mean, that's disrespectful to the county. So in this book, I spelled bourbon with a capital letter all the way. But when I got done, I started looking at bottles of Tennessee bourbon. And I'm thinking, why is Tennessee, trying to publicize a county in Kentucky when they have their own whiskey that they can promote? So it was just a kind of one of those little revelations you come upon when, after trying to figure out something, in this case, just English grammar, all of a sudden I'm looking at bottles of Tennessee whiskey and Tennessee bourbon in a whole different way.
We should talk about George Dickel also. Explain the origin story of George Dickel as you know it.
So the interesting thing about George Dickel is that he gets associated with a distillery, yet he never owned a distillery. And this was something I had to go to the Coffee County archives to find, but because it's always kind of loosely talked about. But George Dickel really started out, he immigrated from Germany. He came to Nashville, started out as a shoe repairman and a shoe salesman. But eventually he ends up in a situation where he meets another German immigrant, Meyer Salzgatter, and Meyer had been around the whiskey wholesaling business when he was in Knoxville, Tennessee. So suddenly now George Dickel has shifted to starting a little whiskey shop, which turns into a whiskey wholesaling business, which becomes one of the biggest wholesaling businesses. It's definitely the biggest one in Tennessee. And in fact, his goal was to supply the Western United States because the railroad had come along and they were able to then do this kind of transportation. But he never really hit the spotlight very often. What was interesting about George Dickel, though, is that of all of the distillers who died and had their obituaries buried in the back pages, he got a sketch and was put on the front page of the Nashville newspaper at that time, which I think was the Banner. And this was pretty much unheard of. So that shows how much clout he actually carried in the state of Tennessee. But it was the president of the George Dickel Company, Manny Schwab, who was the one that found the distillery down in Tullahoma and said, hey, that would be a great distillery. I'm going to buy into it. He ended up buying into it with a guy named Macklin Davis. And Macklin Davis was a longtime distiller and one with an excellent reputation. And it was actually a lot of the stuff in the 20th century George Dickel marketing, talking about mellow as moonlight and all the slogan and how he made his whiskey. Those were all things that Macklin Davis did and that George Dickel kind of got credit for later on, yet Dickel only sold the whiskey. So in other words, Manny bought part of the distillery and then he had a place to sell it through, which was the George Dickel wholesale business that was in Nashville. So it's really an interesting story that I understand why the distillery has a hard time on its tours telling his story, because it is very complicated, but it's also really interesting and at times full of some intrigue as well.
Tell us about the podcast.
So Whiskey Lore started as a fact-finding mission. I had gone to these distilleries. I kept hearing conflicting stories from distillery to distillery on things like bottled and bond or on things like where did the name bourbon come from? And so I decided that I wanted to do a podcast where I would research where these stories came from, how they evolved, and what the truth was behind them. And so I used my storytelling ability to try to craft some really interesting tales and also connect them to regular history, which I do in my Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey history book as well, because I grew up a history fan and whiskey came along later in life, but I love the whiskey stories that I hear. So it seemed like the perfect opportunity for me to tell some history and tie it into where whiskey is. And so that's really what I tried to do with the Whiskey Lore Stories podcast. And what's been interesting about it is since I've done my Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey research, I've since been going back and correcting some of the stuff that I relied a little too much on the internet for my facts. And I'm like, or marketing. And I said, like the Jack Daniel's story, I need to start, correcting these and getting these closer to the research that I'm actually finding by going through archives and going through, old newspapers and trying to get as close to the real story as I can. So it's been an eye opener. And I will say that, you really have to be humble as somebody digging into history, because as soon as you think you know the story, you'll find a fact that comes along that will knock you off your high horse.
Drew Hannush is the host of the Whiskey Lore podcast, and his new book, The Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey, Heroes, Villains, and Legends from a Whiskey Story Time Forgot, is available now through Amazon. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start with the Elijah Craig barrel-proof batch A124 that I mentioned during the news. Once again, it's 10 years and 9 months old and bottled at 59.5% ABV. The nose has classic bourbon notes of caramel, leather, tobacco, honey, and dry spices. The taste is thick, chewy, and spicy with black pepper and clove, balanced by caramel, leather, tobacco, and honey. The finish, long and spicy with a touch of oak. I'm scoring the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Bourbon Batch A124 a 92. Next up, the venerable Cyrus Noble Bourbon from Haas Brothers in San Francisco. This Kentucky bourbon is bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of red apples, raspberries, caramel, and toffee. The taste is fruity with red apples, raspberries, white pepper, honey, and vanilla, while the finish is long and fruity with a hint of spice. I'm scoring the Cyrus Noble Bourbon a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 200-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature double oak cask strength or reserve series rye whiskeys at a retailer near you. Visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye and please drink responsibly. Now let's look at an unusual 4-grain American whiskey from Kokoro Spirits in California. The 2021 limited edition is bottled at 56.3% ABV, and I received a sample the other day. The nose has touches of honey, butterscotch, and caramel. The taste has cinnamon, black pepper, and a hint of clove, with honey and caramel in the background, and the finish is long and peppery. In my mind, it's a bit one-dimensional, focusing on the spices, and I'm scoring the Kokoro Spirits 4-grain American whiskey an 88. Finally, the Garrison Brothers 2024 edition of Guadalupe goes on sale this weekend. It's finished in port wine casks for 2 years and bottled at 53.5% ABV. The nose is full of honey, oak, fresh berries, soft spices, and a hint of plums. The taste is complex and smooth with raspberry jam, white pepper, a hint of clove, coffee beans, and dark chocolate. The finish is long and well-rounded with berries, chocolates, and a hint of spice. I'm scoring the 2024 edition of Garrison Brothers Guadalupe a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
At Dewar's, we're gearing up to unveil a prestigious 4-part collector series of exceptionally high-end blended malts. The first gem in this collection, none other than the extraordinary Dewar's Double 37-year-old, a blended malt that is nothing short of remarkable. The Double 37-year-old undergoes Dewar's cutting-edge 4-stage aging process, meticulously designed to draw out the essence of whiskey barrels dating back to the late 80s. The result? An impeccable balance and a level of smoothness that is off the charts. To pay homage to the Speyside whiskey producing region, it gets an extra tip of the hat with a finishing process resting in Oloroso sherry casks that once cradled the prestigious Altmore single malt whiskey. As for the taste adventure, brace yourself for captivating notes that include the warmth of cinnamon, the velvety sweetness of heather honey, succulent juiciness of peaches, zesty pops of orange peel, and a decadent shower of brown sugar. And let me be clear, I'm merely giving you a glimpse of the sensational flavor adventure this whiskey has in store. This exceptional whiskey, though, is a rare find, so stay vigilant and find it at a store near you.
Let's open up the WhiskyCast community app and see what people are talking about this week. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey. Dennis posted this comment in the app the other day. I saw a recent post by the Glenallachie on social media which stated, quote, "At the Glenallachie Distillery, we will always operate with honesty and integrity, which is why we don't chill filter or add color to our premium liquid." I understand the general debate that chill filtering and or adding color can lead to, but I found the reference to honesty and integrity a bit much. Are there distilleries out there purposely trying to hide the fact that they engage in these processes, for example? Leon from the Malt Mariners responded with this. I agree. It sounds like they imply that other distilleries are not honest. In my opinion, the color discussion is a bit overstated, and as a distillery that uses countless casks to finish mostly aged but maybe not quite mature whiskey to add some color and flavor, I'd be careful to use these kind of self-praise. Talking about your own quality is fine, but implying others are lying or cheating doesn't sit well with me. Here's my take. I don't think other distilleries are deliberately trying to hide their use of caramel coloring or chill filtering. They may not always be as transparent as we'd like, but to call their honesty and integrity into question may be going a bit far. I'd be interested to know who wrote that original post for the Glenallachie, and whether Glenallachie owner Billy Walker signed off on it before it was posted. What's your take? Share it with us on the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the iOS or Android app stores and join the conversation. You can also find us on Threads, X, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and our email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com.
100 individual farms of Irish barley, separately harvested, malted, fermented, distilled and matured. Is that too much effort? Perhaps. Unless you're interested in flavour above all else. Waterford Whiskey, the most naturally flavoursome single malt.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Balcones Distilling. I want to go back to our interview with Drew Hannush for a moment and talk about the origins of the Lincoln County process for charcoal filtering whiskey before maturation. It's clear now that the original concept did not start in Tennessee, with Nearest Green and Jack Daniel as modern history tells us. In his book, Hannush explains how New Jersey inventor Burgess Allison filed for a patent on the process with the U.S. Patent Office in 1802, long before Jack Daniel and Nearest Green were born. That appears to be the earliest recording of what we know today as the Lincoln County process, but Hannush also writes that a couple of years later, Massachusetts Senator and future President John Quincy Adams publicly criticized Allison's patent as a case of patent abuse. Adams called it an example of inventors claiming credit for long-established practices. Of course, we'll never know just where the Lincoln County process was created or by whom, but debating origin stories like that are just part of the fun of whiskey. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Balcones Distilling, the original Texas whiskey at the forefront of the American single malt movement, exploring place and provenance with unique style whiskeys, ranging from the award-winning Texas One and Lineage American single malts to their Baby Blue straight corn whiskey and Texas Rye bottled and bond. Discover whiskey from a new perspective at balconesdistilling.com. That's all for this week's episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and Threads at WhiskyCast, or you can use the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the Apple and Google App Stores. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Dewar's Double 37-year-old blended malt whiskey is a true collector's treasure, a rarity worth hunting for and cherishing, perhaps sharing with the lucky few. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2023 Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 48% alcohol by volume.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2024, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.